Welcome back, Seekers and Saints, to Fire in the Bones vlog, and this is referring to the sermon Koinonia on September 16th. So, September 16th, 2023. So, in that sermon, Pastor Shane wanted to talk about why people leave the church. And he honed in on he gave three specific examples. One was that the leadership was autocratic. And I have been part of a church where that was happening and we had to leave. I don't have time to talk about that so much, but what I will say is this. For leadership, this is aimed at leadership. Consider that in the Bible, the prophets and Jesus leveled their greatest accusations and criticisms at the leadership of the church. Consider that. I'll leave it at that. The second point is maybe people suffer and that causes them to want to leave the church because they feel like God wasn't there with them. We're going to talk more about that, so put a pin in that. The third reason is people leave because they don't feel a sense of community or friendship. That is the point that Pastor Shane really went at length about. So if you want to learn more about that, go back to the sermon. I recommend it. Great, great sermon. Let's go back to point 2, suffering. Suffering and leaving the church. It reminded me of 2 events that happened in my life when I was a child. The first was when I was about 5 or 6, I had a urinary tract infection or a blockage. And eventually they had to use a catheter. Now, as a 5 or 6-year-old, I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what was happening. I just knew it was going to be some kind of surgery. That's all I understood. It wasn't surgery, but I thought it was. And my mother couldn't be in the room because there wasn't enough room for her. And she just had to sit in the waiting room and listen to me scream. And she said at one point she had to step out for a minute. She couldn't stand it. Another story is when I had a fever of 104.5. For anybody outside the U.S., that's about 40 degrees Celsius. And my father took me to the doctor, and all he could do was put his arm around me as I slouched in the chair. He couldn't help me. In both of those cases, I was suffering, but my parents were with me and sympathetic. Should I have left them because I was suffering? Of course not. Now, someone might be inclined to say, well, but God could end the suffering. So why doesn't he do that? That's why I left. Well, for one, don't blame the church on what God decided to do, because the church doesn't control God. God controls the church. But 2, there's some reasons we're going to get into as to why God allows suffering or lets it happen or why it exists at all. But before we get into that, the one thing I just want to stress is that God is with you. Like my parents, he is sympathetic. In Romans 8, 26 and 27, it talks about how the Holy Spirit groans with us, how it prays and intercedes for us when we're suffering or in need of anything like wisdom or healing. God is not absent. He's present. He's just unfortunate he's invisible sometimes, that's all. But he's always there. So why suffering then? Why is this not good enough to leave the church? Well, for one, where are you going to go that's not suffering? Romans 8:22 says the creation groans with sin. Consider a house. If you build a house and one side, just one beam, a support beam, is just 1/8 of an inch off, the whole house goes off kilter. In the machine shop industry, we call that out of tolerance. If one part was out of tolerance, the whole batch would go wrong. The whole adjustment would be gone, and you could run a whole run of parts that just are junk. And that's what sin is. It's a measurement that went off and turned all of creation off kilter. With that in mind, that is where suffering comes in. You think disease and all the other problems that are part of our world were in God's plan? No. We don't have time to get into why God allowed sin or why it happened or why God did not directly jump in and stop the serpent. But suffice it to say That happened, and this is the result. You're going to be in a world where you can't avoid suffering. So how is running from the church going to get rid of that? But then sometimes God allows suffering for different reasons. One is because he's trying to refine you. He might be, 1 Peter chapter 1 says that God is refining us like fire in verses 6 and 7. Sometimes you need to go through that mistake or that difficulty so God could use you later. Pastor Shane went through a time of infertility, but he went through an adoption process, and now he can coach other people through that. I could think of times I'm able to preach this because of my time in leaving the church because I was going through difficulty. So God allows these things to refine us. Could God come in and just tell us, well, don't do this, do that, do this, don't do that? Sure, he could. But then you won't gain the character you need for later work. Another reason is suffering because you're a Christian. That's not God's fault. That's just the result of everything. Jesus, in John 15 says, they hated you before they hated me. And James 1:2 says you should rejoice when you're suffering. Not when, or not if, but when. So if you're having difficulty socially because of Jesus, you should expect that. That's going to happen. So now, a quick note, if you're sanctimonious or pushing people out of your life, you kind of deserve it. And the church in no way tells you to shun your family. If you're in a church where they're telling you shun everybody not in the church, that's a cult you need to run. But if your family or friends or someone else is leaving you just because you're Christian or they can't take it anymore, I'm sorry, that hurts, but Jesus said that count on that happening. A final reason for suffering could be because of disobedience. Remember Jonah and the whale? He ran, and God had to swallow him up with a whale to get him back on track. Granted, God understood why Jonah didn't want to do the job, but Jonah still had a job to do. And even after he did it, God was sympathetic. When Jonah was in the shade, God provided a flower for shade. Now he wound up taking that away to teach Jonah another lesson, but he never turned his back on Jonah, even when Jonah was being difficult. So with these things in mind, why is there suffering? What could the solution be? Well, that goes back to point 3, which Shane was talking about. Koinonia. Get in a community. Find your friend group in the church. You're not going to mesh with everybody. But that might mean asking, hey, is there a group that does this? Is there a service project that does that? Is there a group of people that like this sort of thing? Whatever. Find a group in the church and get plugged in. Now, sure, maybe you left a church because it was small or you had a family and there was no way for it to take care of family needs. All right, that's fine. But you go to another church then. You just don't leave altogether. Maybe you left a church because you got burnt. Okay, then you find another church. Maybe you left a church because theologically there was something wrong, like I mentioned. All right, but you find another church. You just don't bail on the Big C church, you just bail on that one. But get plugged into Koinonia, and that's the best way to take care of it. So here's the conclusion of the matter. Suffering is like a movie slasher villain. You can separate from the group and run off into another room, but much like in the movie, and much like suffering, the slasher villain and the suffering is just waiting for you in the room you just ran into. The only difference now is that you're alone. That's all for today. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time on Fire in the Bones.